to week 2. So this week we'll be talking about job costing, and we'll be walking through some toolkits for businesses that are producing custom products and how they account for the cost of the job. This is not limited to physical products, could also be used for service providing businesses. I try to make it as focused as possible on small businesses, but the same principle can be applied to large businesses as well. So the goal of this lecture or presentation is to showcase how you calculate the cost of a job and how you allocate costs. Now, there are different types of allocating costs to a product, whether job or service, whether physical products or intangible products. Right here, and I have two, which is job and process costing. We also have third method, which is called the hybrid method. That is not the key focus of this topic. Our key focus will mainly be on the job costing, but it's also good to understand the difference between the job costing and process costing. And of course, the combination of this is what we call the hybrid costing. Now, think of a small shop around the corner that bakes cakes for birthday, for wedding, or all kinds of ceremonies. The type of products they produce will vary. They depend on the customer's expectation or the customer's request. And that includes the time spent on producing that job, which we call the direct labor cost, and then the raw materials that are used for the production of the product, like the cake that is requested by customer. And of course, the utilities that is used, such as electricity or other not significant indirect material or indirect labor, such as preheating the oven once the production is completed. So all of this will result in varied costs that needs to be accounted for in order to be able to charge your customer more accurately. Usually, when you apply job cost, in most cases, they are often low volume type of production. So the key part of that production is not a mass production, and therefore the accounting for such production or services is very unique in the sense that you focus on the resource that is used on each of the specific job. Can be time consuming, but of course, that is the nature of the business. And in order to have the accurate costing of the products or services, it has to be done in a more kind of job focused situation. Now, compare that to organizations that are producing goods in large volumes, which we call the mass production. A good example of that will be your Coca-Cola plant that produces bottle of your drinks, whether Coke or Fanta. Now, if you look at that large organization, they are mass production company, and there are a series of processes that are involved, from the mixing of the materials to the bottling of the products and the batch numbering of the products. All of these are steps in the production process, and each of that will be completed by different departments. And therefore, the best way to account for such production activity is to total the cost incurred in each of the process and then average the cost across the number of units produced from the process. In as much as that is not our focus, let's move on to look at the case of job costing. Assuming we're looking at Grand Junction City custom furniture that produces desk and table. Let's assume that this company incurred raw material costs worth $355,000. And then the direct labor cost, which are the furniture makers who have expertise or directly involved in the conversion of wood or other accessories required to produce the desk and the table. The total labor cost is $169,000 that was spent in the period. And then the manufacturing overhead cost, which also include the supervisor's cost, is 28,000 plus the utility costs such as electricity, the depreciation of the production plant, all of that equal to $28,000. All these are different types of costs that was incurred to produce the desk and the tables that was specifically required by a new elementary school in Grand Junction. They require a specific format, a specific design, and so on. And therefore, we will consider that as a job. And therefore, we will also calculate the raw material, the direct labor cost, and the manufacturing overhead cost required for that specific type of business. Now, let's look at how the overhead cost will be allocated. The total cost of the job for the example I just gave, the Grand Junction elementary school, given that that furniture company is producing the desk and the table for them, the total cost will be your raw material used for that job, plus direct labor cost, plus overhead cost. But the problem in that cost is the overhead. Up to time, we don't know what the overhead could be. That is because as time passes on, you require some indirect material or indirect labor that sometimes vary depending on wastage in the process, delay in the process, and unforeseeable circumstances. All of that build into the overhead cost, and that is problematic. And when you talk to a small business owner, this is one of the areas where they lack competitive advantage because they cannot accurately or close to accurately estimate their overhead costs. They are either overcharging for their services or products, or they undercharge for their services or products. And for their competitors who have better systems to estimate the overhead and more accurately allocate the overhead, they will be on sustainable profit or competitive advantage over a long period of time. Up to time, we don't know what the total overhead is going to be, but we can estimate what it could be based on calculated guess. How many hours is going to be required to produce the products? How many quantity of indirect materials will be required? How many indirect labor will we need in terms of cleaning the factory or maintenance or all kinds of indirect labor? All of that are part of the overhead cost. So one principle that we use, because you can only know the actual overhead at the end of the period, is to allocate the overhead based on what we call the predetermined overhead allocation rates, which is the PORO, popularly abbreviated in some instances that way. So the predetermined overhead rate is basically knowing what your estimated overhead cost is going to be per annum, and then divide that by the total allocation based. Sometimes some companies will use machine hours. Sometimes some other companies will use direct labor hours. I've also seen companies that have used number of units produced. So there are multiple ways you can allocate the overhead. In a more accounting sense, what we try to do is to break the overhead to different categories as much as possible and find out what drives the overhead to be incurred. For example, we could allocate the electricity cost by the number of machine hours. While we could allocate the depreciation cost by the number of units produced, or we could allocate the factory maintenance cost by the direct labor hours. So we break down the overhead cost into multiple categories, and then we have multiple allocation base. But for most small businesses, they don't have that resources. According to Sydney, the best way to allocate overhead is to compare the cost-benefit analysis, the amount of time you spend trying to identify your overhead and estimate your overhead against the amount you intend to save from that. So typically, small businesses will put all the overhead together, and then they will use one single allocation base. And up to time, that is always not very accurate but still better off than not having a system at all of allocating the overhead. Here's an example. You could see here that we have the estimated labor cost to be $68,000. And labor cost could also be used to allocate the overhead in some cases. So the estimated overhead is equal to $68,000. The estimated labor cost is $70,000. Let's say in our example, the overhead allocation rate is based on direct labor cost. And we know the direct labor cost in this example is $170,000. And then the estimated overhead cost for the year is $68,000. Therefore, if a job requires us to use 1 hour of direct labor, in that case, we will multiply the direct labor cost by 1.4, or we will increase the cost by 40% because we allocate the overhead based on direct labor cost. So our predetermined overhead allocation rate in this example is 40%. In application, let's assume that for job 27, the direct labor cost is 1,250. Therefore, the overhead cost will be 1,250 multiplied by 40% or 0.4. So that gives you your overhead applied to this particular job. In this example, the overhead will be $500. Now, the cost flow basically goes into what we call the T account, where you have the debit and the credit, and then you kind of move costs over different sets of accounts from your direct materials account to your work in process account. From your work in process account, once those jobs are completed, it goes into finished goods account. And once some parts of those finished goods account are sold, the value of the units that are sold goes into the cost of goods sold. In this example here, let's again look at the Grand Junction custom furniture, which completed 644,600, and move this completed unit away from the T account, then it goes into the finished goods account. In my class, I'll typically show this in a T account example, so students could see how that cost move and what we do to the debit side or the credit side of our T account for the work in process and the finished goods account. Remember, it typically starts from the raw materials. Again, I talked about that perhaps in the previous recording I did, when I said that typically your production process starts from the time you have your raw materials, and then you add value to that raw material through what we call the conversion process. And that is why in the cost categorization process, typically on 2 categories, I will have what we call the prime cost and then the conversion cost. Typically, your prime cost, that will be your direct labor, your direct cost, which is material cost, raw material cost, and direct labor cost. Your conversion cost is basically your direct labor cost and then your overhead cost. When we look at this example further, we say if some of the goods that were in finished goods accounts were sold, then we will recognize that value of the goods that were sold in our cost of goods sold. Okay, so it then reduces the value in the finished goods account, and then it increases the value in the cost of goods sold accounts. Let's say, for example, that for job 27 or different jobs that were sold, which means we completed those jobs and delivered it to the customer, and that job was 884,600, then the value will increase, will include in the cost of goods sold will be 584,600. Then if you look at the finished goods account we had earlier, which is 644,600, And then you take away the value of cost of goods sold, which is 584,600. What you're going to have in your finished goods account is going to be 600,000. That's what we call the finished goods inventory account. That amount will sit in your statement of financial position, which is popularly called the balance sheet. Now, at the end of the year, we often do not know what the overhead cost is in all the process during the trading year that we've had. Often remember, when you give quotes to your customers, it is quotes that you promise that that is what the cost is going to be, and you are expected to invoice that amount you provide in your quote. And the overhead you include in your quote is based on 40% in our case, which is the predetermined overhead cost. Now, the actual overhead could be more than that, and you only know that at the end of the period or at the end of the job production. In that case, the actual overhead could be equal to or less than or greater than the estimated overhead. In that case, you're going to have either over-applied overhead or under-allocated overhead. For example, if our actual overhead is $83,000 and our applied overhead, which means allocated overhead based on estimation, is 67,600. Than what we estimated we're going to spend on the overhead. And therefore, we have to account for this. Otherwise, our statement of balance sheet may not balance, and our income statement will be inaccurate. So typically, when you under-allocate overhead, you cross that under-allocation to the cost of goods sold. So what you should do in that case is basically to debit your cost of goods sold by the under-allocated overhead. When you debit the cost of goods sold by the under-allocated overhead, that will increase your cost of goods sold by that amount. And then you credit your manufacturing overhead account by that amount. And then that kind of close down or write off your manufacturing overhead account. I always tell my students this: your manufacturing overhead account is more or less a suspense account. At the end of the financial year, you close that account off. And the way you close it off is to reconcile the account by the under-allocated or over-allocated overhead. In this example, when we debit the cost of goods sold, that will increase our cost of goods sold by the under-allocated amount, and that will reflect in the production cost of the manufactured products. So typically, accounting for a job, the most complex part of it is your overhead allocation. And that's why I mentioned this at the beginning. It's one of the cumbersome issues facing most small businesses. And when this is done more accurately, then your pricing will be more accurate. And therefore, you are more competitive in the long run compared to other competitors who probably do not have a better costing system. So in my next presentation, we'll be walking through a spreadsheet example in more detail on how you account for job, just putting this into more practice with some data on how we pass through different tin accounts from the raw material point to the cost of goods sold account.